Taxi drivers are always crossing paths with the unexpected on the streets. Today, you will be transported by real stories of unsettling apparitions and lost souls still seeking rest. But beware, by the end, you might wonder if what lurks in the dark of night is really as distant as you think. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more content. Let's move on to the first story.
My name is Paul, and I've been a taxi driver for over 20 years. I've seen everything on the streets of this city, but nothing compares to what happened on that rainy October night. I still get chills just thinking about it and sometimes wonder, would it have been better if I had never started that fare? It was an especially dark night. The clouds were so thick that the moon and stars couldn't shed any light. The rain fell incessantly, and the streets were almost deserted. I was driving slowly, trying to avoid puddles and the few people who still dared to walk along the dark sidewalks. The radio was off, and the sound of the windshield wipers was the only thing breaking the oppressive silence of my cab. I was almost done with my shift and thinking about heading home when I saw a man waving at me from a corner. He was standing under the dim light of a street lamp, and his silhouette seemed almost ethereal under the torrential rain. There was something strange about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Nevertheless, I stopped the car and rolled down the window. "Good evening. Need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound friendly despite the uneasy feeling beginning to form in my stomach. He didn't respond immediately, just stood there looking at me with eyes that seemed empty. Finally, he nodded and got into the car, closing the door with a sound that echoed eerily in the night silence. "Where to?" I asked, trying to hide my discomfort. He murmured the address of a distant neighborhood, and, without thinking twice, I started driving. The silence in the car was almost tangible, and I could feel my nerves starting to fray. The man didn't say a word during the entire trip. He just stared out the window, watching the rain hit the glass as I drove. I couldn't help but look at him in the rearview mirror. He was dressed in an old-fashioned black suit, and his skin had a pale, almost translucent hue. There was something wrong with him, but I couldn't identify what it was. I tried to focus on the road, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. When we finally arrived at the destination, I turned to him, ready to ask about the payment, but the back seat was empty. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I thought he had left the car without me noticing. I looked around for any sign of him, but there was no one. I muttered to myself, feeling panic start to rise up my spine. I looked in the rearview mirror again and almost let out a scream. The man was there, at the corner where I had picked him up, waving at me again. It seemed impossible, but there he was, exactly in the same spot, with his hands trembling. I started the car and drove away as fast as I could. My heart was racing, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. What had just happened? Who was that man, and how had he returned to the corner so quickly? In the following days, I tried to forget the incident. I told the story to some colleagues, hoping someone could give me a rational explanation, but everyone laughed, saying I was probably tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. However, I couldn't convince myself of that. The image of that man waving at me in the rain wouldn't leave my mind. I decided to investigate the address he had given me, hoping to find some answers. The next night, I drove to the neighborhood where the man had disappeared. It was an old part of the city, full of Victorian houses and narrow streets. The place had a heavy atmosphere and seemed like time had stopped there. When I arrived at the address, my breath caught in my throat. It was an old house, with broken windows and peeling paint, looking like it had been abandoned for years. I got out of the car and walked to the door, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. I knocked, but no one answered. I tried to open it, but it was locked. So, I walked around the house, trying to find any clue. When I reached the backyard, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was an old newspaper stuck in a bush, dated 10 years ago. The headline read, "Man dies in car accident on the way to work." There was a photo of the man I had picked up in the cab. The article said he had died on his way to work after being hit by a car while trying to cross the street in the rain. My mind spun as I tried to understand what this meant. Had I picked up the ghost of a dead man? Was he trapped in an endless cycle trying to get to work? I decided to return to the place where I had first seen the man. When I got there, the corner was empty. I felt a temporary relief, but then something caught my attention. On the ground, where he had been standing, was a small silver locket. I picked it up and examined it. There was an inscription, "Always with me." My whole body trembled. I went back to the car, clutching the locket tightly. Suddenly, I heard a knock on the window. I looked and saw the man, wet and pale, staring directly at me. "Help me," he whispered, his voice sounding like a distant echo. I trembled with fear, but something inside me knew I had to help. I opened the door and he got in again, asking to be taken to the same address. I drove in silence, my heart racing. When we arrived at the house, he looked at me and said, "Thank you." Now, as he got out of the car and disappeared into the darkness, I rested. The next morning, I returned to the house, and to my surprise, it looked different. The windows were repaired and the paint was renewed. I knocked on the door and an elderly woman answered. "Can I help you?" she asked. I explained what had happened and she began to cry. She told me that her son, the man from the newspaper, had died trying to get to work 10 years ago. Since then, she had felt his presence but never managed to see him. I showed her the locket and she sobbed. This was his. He always wore it. We hugged in silence. She was finally able to say goodbye to her son, and I felt a strange peace within me. Since then, I haven't seen the man again, but I always carry the memory of that night with me. Whether you believe it or not, that's for you to decide. But one thing is certain, there is more between heaven and earth than we can understand. I never saw the man again, but I know he finally found peace, and I, though still haunted by what happened, have learned to respect the unknown and cherish every moment we have. If there's one thing that experience taught me, it's that sometimes, even in the strangest and most terrifying circumstances, we can find a purpose and make a difference in someone's life or death. Life goes on and I continue driving through the city streets, always alert, always waiting. Because, after all, you never know who might get into your cab on the next fare. My name is Jack, and I've been a taxi driver for over 2 decades. I've seen a lot on these streets, but nothing prepared me for the night I encountered a mystery that still haunts me to this day. It was an experience that changed my life forever. It was an especially cold and rainy winter night, the kind of night when no one wants to go outside. The streets were almost deserted, and I was wrapping up my shift, eager to get back to my warm home. I was driving down Main Avenue when I saw a woman waving desperately at me on the sidewalk. I pulled over and rolled down the window. She looked visibly distressed, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. Her hair was soaked and clinging to her face, and her hands were trembling as she held a handbag. "Please, help me, my daughter is missing," she cried, her voice laden with desperation. Immediately, my heart ached. I saw the fear in her eyes and knew I couldn't ignore her plea. She got into the cab and handed me a piece of paper with a picture of a little girl, about 6 years old, with long brown hair and a timid smile. Her name was Emily. "Where did you last see her?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "At the city park, near the fountain. We were taking a walk when she disappeared. Please, we need to find her." I drove to the park as quickly as I could. The woman was silently crying in the back seat, clutching the photo of her daughter as if it were her last hope. We arrived at the park and began searching for Emily. The rain made it difficult to see, and the park was deserted, which heightened the sense of despair. We wandered through the park, calling for Emily, but there was no sign of her. The woman was becoming increasingly frantic, and I felt helpless. Then I noticed something on the ground near the fountain, a small, well-loved doll. The woman rushed to the doll and picked it up, crying even harder. "This is her favorite doll. She was here," she said, her voice trembling. We continued our search, expanding our area to the streets surrounding the park. At every corner and alley, we called for Emily, but as the night wore on, we found nothing. I knew we needed help, so I suggested we go to the police. On the way to the station, the woman kept murmuring her daughter's name, as if fearing that silence would make her even more distant. When we arrived, I explained the situation to the on-duty officer, who immediately began organizing a search. While we waited at the station, the woman huddled on a bench, clutching the doll. There was something strange about her, but I couldn't quite place it. Her anguish was palpable, yet there was an unsettling sense of helplessness that bothered me. The officers went out to search, and I decided to stay at the station with the woman. Hours dragged on, and dawn approached. The woman seemed increasingly exhausted, and I felt powerless. Finally, one of the officers returned, but there was no good news. They hadn't found any sign of Emily. I wanted to offer some comfort, but I was at a loss for words. The woman looked at me with empty eyes and whispered, "She's gone." I knew this might happen, but I couldn't let her go. I was confused by her words, but before I could ask, she stood up and walked out of the station, slowly making her way into the rain. I tried to follow her, but when I reached the door, she had vanished into the darkness. I went home that morning, feeling exhausted and disturbed. The woman's face and the image of little Emily wouldn't leave my mind. I decided to investigate more about the woman and her daughter. The next day, I returned to the park and asked the locals if they knew the woman or the girl. An elderly man, sitting on a bench near the fountain, heard my description and his face went pale. "Are you talking about Maria and Emily?" he asked, his voice sending chills down my spine. "Yes, I think so. Do you know them?" I replied, anxious. I knew them many years ago. Maria was a devoted mother, but Emily disappeared almost 20 years ago. She never got over the loss and died of grief soon after. My blood ran cold. This was impossible. I had spoken to Maria the night before. She was desperate and searching for her daughter. How could this be true? She used to wander the park searching for Emily. Many say they still see her on rainy nights, but no one believes it. "I guess you had the misfortune of encountering her." I didn't know what to think. I tried to rationalize what had happened, but nothing made sense. I decided to go back to the station and request to see the records of Emily's case. The officers were understanding and allowed me to review the old files. There was Emily's photo, the same one Maria had shown me. The report detailed the disappearance and the subsequent search that yielded nothing. There was also a note about Maria's death, mentioning that she had never accepted the loss of her daughter. I left the station with a sense of disbelief. Everything I knew had been turned upside down. Maria and Emily were dead. Who had I spoken to that night, and why did I still feel the need to help? I went back to the park once more, hoping to find some answers. The park was empty and silent. I walked to the fountain where we had found the doll and knelt there, trying to figure out what to do next. It was then that I heard a soft whisper, "Thank you for trying to help me." I looked around, but saw no one. However, I felt a sense of peace, as if I had finally done something right. Maybe, in some way, my attempt to help Maria and Emily had allowed them to find peace. Since that night, I have never seen Maria or heard of Emily again, but the experience has profoundly changed me. Now, when I drive through dark, rainy streets, I stay alert, always hoping that someone might need help. Because, after all, you never know what might happen when the next person gets into your cab. And so I go on with my life, carrying the memories of that night, memories of a desperate mother, a lost child, and an encounter that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. Life goes on, but I will never forget Maria and Emily, and the lesson I learned that sometimes despair and pain know no bounds, and that we must always be willing to help, even when it seems impossible. My name is Luke, and I've been a taxi driver for over 20 years. In all that time, I've transported every kind of person and encountered many strange situations. However, none compare to the night I picked up a passenger from another world. That experience still haunts me and sometimes makes me question what we really know about reality. It was a cold winter night, with thick fog covering the city streets. Visibility was terrible, and I was driving slowly, alert to any movement. I was almost finished with my shift, eager to get home and warm up, when I saw a man waving to me through the fog at the corner of an empty street. He was well dressed in an old-fashioned black suit and a felt hat. There was something odd about him, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I stopped the taxi next to him, and he quickly got in, closing the door with a sound that echoed in the stillness of the night. "Good evening, sir." "Where to?" I asked, trying to hide the discomfort beginning to form in my stomach. He looked at me with penetrating eyes that seemed to see through me and said calmly, "To St. John's Cemetery." A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't common for someone to request a trip to a cemetery at that hour, but since it was my job, I didn't question it and began driving. During the ride, The silence in the car was almost palpable. The man said not a word, only gazing out the window at the thick fog enveloping the city. I tried to make conversation a few times, but he didn't respond, only nodding or murmuring inaudibly. As I drove, I couldn't help but glance at him through the rearview mirror. There was something outdated about his appearance, as if he belonged to another era. His suit, though elegant, seemed out of fashion. His hands were pale, almost translucent. Finally, we arrived at St. John's Cemetery. It was an old place, with weathered tombstones and twisted trees casting eerie shadows under the moonlight. I stopped the taxi at the entrance and turned to the man, ready to ask about payment. He looked me in the eyes and, with a mysterious smile, said, "Thank you, Luke, for your kindness." He handed me an old silver coin and got out of the car. I watched as he walked towards the cemetery gates. When his figure disappeared into the darkness, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I looked at the coin in my hand. It was an ancient piece with symbols I didn't recognize and an inscription in a language I didn't understand. Feeling a mix of curiosity and fear, I decided to investigate more about the cemetery and that strange coin. The next morning, I went to an antique store in the city center. I showed the coin to the store owner, an elderly man who immediately frowned. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his tone unsettling. "A client gave it to me as payment for a ride to St. John's Cemetery." The store owner looked at me with wide eyes and said, "This coin is very old. It belongs to the 19th century and was used by a secret society that existed back then. They say these members perform strange rituals at St. John's Cemetery." I felt a knot in my stomach. Who was that man I had taken to the cemetery? Why did he have such an old coin? I decided to return to the cemetery that night. I was determined to uncover more about the mysterious man and the secrets he seemed to hide. When I arrived, the fog was even thicker, and the cemetery looked even darker. I walked among the tombstones, trying to find any clue. Then I saw a faint light coming from a crypt at the far end of the cemetery. My heart raced, but curiosity was stronger. I approached slowly, trying not to make noise. When I reached the crypt's entrance, I saw the door slightly ajar. I peeked inside and saw the mysterious man. He was kneeling in front of an altar, murmuring words in an unknown language. In his hands, he held the same coin he had given me. Suddenly, he turned and looked me directly in the eyes. A sinister smile formed on his lips. I felt a wave of terror engulf me. I wanted to run, but my legs were paralyzed. "You shouldn't be here, Luke," he said, his voice echoing through the crypt. I finally managed to move and ran as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached my taxi, my heart pounding uncontrollably. I got in the car and drove away as quickly as I could, not looking back. The next morning, still shaken by the experience, I decided to tell a few fellow taxi drivers. They listened attentively, but many seemed skeptical. One of them, however, told me something that left me even more unsettled. "There's a legend about a man who died in the 19th century. They say he was a member of a secret society and that his soul never found peace. Many people claim to have seen his ghost at St. John's Cemetery. Since that night, I've avoided going near the cemetery, but the image of the mysterious man and the old coin never left my mind. I felt an urgent need to understand what had happened. I went back to the antique store and asked the owner if he knew more about the secret society and the man I had seen. He told me an even more disturbing story. That secret society was known for its macabre rituals. They say they invoked spirits and performed sacrifices at the cemetery. The man you described was one of their leaders. He was found dead under mysterious circumstances, and many believe his spirit still roams the cemetery, trying to complete some unfinished ritual. My blood ran cold. Who was that man I had taken in my taxi? Why was he still performing rituals at the cemetery? I decided I needed answers. The next night, I returned to the cemetery armed with a flashlight and newfound courage. I walked to the crypt where I had last seen the man. The door was once again slightly open, and a faint light emanated from inside. With my heart pounding, I pushed the door and entered. There he was, the mysterious man, kneeling in front of the altar. This time, he didn't seem surprised to see me. "I knew you'd come back, Luke," he said with an enigmatic smile. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I am someone who hasn't found peace," he replied. "My soul is trapped here, between the world of the living and the dead. I need to complete the ritual to finally rest. He handed me the old coin and said, "You can help me, Luke. Place the coin on the altar and say the words I will teach you." I felt a deep fear, but something inside me told me I needed to help. I held the coin firmly and did as he asked. When I finished, a bright light filled the crypt, and the man smiled one last time before disappearing before my eyes. I left the crypt feeling an odd peace. I knew that somehow I had helped that lost soul find rest. Since then, I haven't seen the man again, but the experience changed me profoundly. Today, when I drive through the city streets, I stay alert for any sign that someone needs help, because sometimes helping a lost soul is more important than anything else.
Thanks for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss any new and terrifying videos.